Just want to say a few more things about this section on utilitarianism. The first part of their presentation pretty much relies on Jeremy Bentham's utilitarianism in the early part of the 1800s. The latter part of the 1800s, John Stuart Mill, a follower of Bentham, uh, was the leading utilitarian, and I don't think that his notion of what utilitarianism was really different from Bentham's, but there's a couple of issues that are intrinsically interesting in which perhaps they did differ, and I thought that would be worth commenting on. Again, just read the text; everything's very well explained. These are just supplementary, these videos, but Section 9, Mill's qualitative utilitarianism, is a very interesting point. Apparently, with Bentham, Bentham made no distinction between different sorts of pleasures being better than in other sorts of pleasures. Um, this is a quote here where Bentham wrote, "Prejudice apart, the game of pushpin is of equal value with the arts and sciences of music and poetry." And the author's comment is, "All that matters for Bentham is producing pleasure, and the way this is achieved is unimportant. If playing on a console affords you more pleasure than reading Shakespeare, then Bentham would view your life as going better if you played the console." So it's an interesting point, and perhaps Bentham is perfectly consistent in saying, well, I mean, pleasure is the good, and pleasure is pleasure. Right? So it doesn't matter what you get pleasure from. That's the good, for you at least. Mill had a different idea. If you read John Stuart Mill's book, Utilitarianism, he spends a lot of time at the beginning defending utilitarianism and defending hedonism from the objection that to say that pleasure is the good or pleasure is the point of life or we should just try to maximize our pleasures is to regard human beings as no different than pigs. And maybe Bentham would say, yeah, it's okay. Pigs are just animals that seek pleasure, and human beings are animals that seek pleasure. But Mill was not satisfied with that. And one of the very famous quotes from utilitarianism here, "It is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied." The idea that human life is not just about maximizing pleasures, human life is about the pursuit of particularly human pleasures. That is, the idea is that the pig, as opposed to the human being, has a narrow collection, array of pleasures, whereas a human being is capable of all sorts of other, let's say, more elevated pleasures, more complex pleasures than the pig. And Socrates is maybe not fully satisfied like the fool is, but Socrates is capable of so much more than the fool that he wouldn't change places because the kind of pleasures, intellectual pleasures, let's say, that Socrates is capable of are so much more satisfying than the pleasures that are available to the fool. So Mill is actually talking about, I think, a very important point, and that is that it's the kind of pleasures that we're seeking which matter at least as much as the amount of pleasure that we get in determining our happiness. Mill was thinking of the intellectual pleasures, the pleasures of art, literature, thinking, pleasures of imagination, and the pleasures of feeling. That these human pleasures that we try to cultivate in our educations, for instance. Um, and he had a very interesting proof of this. That he wanted to prove that these elevated pleasures, the pleasures of the mind, pleasures of feeling and imagination, were actually more pleasurable than the physical pleasures. And his proof of that was that if you talk to anybody who's experienced both, they will prefer the so-called higher pleasures over the so-called lower pleasures. That the proof is in what people actually would choose or prefer, which is an interesting claim. I don't know if it's true, but a quite interesting claim. The last thing I want to comment on is just the idea, the difference between act utilitarianism and rule utilitarianism, which is actually quite important, I think, issue within utilitarianism. Should we just do as Bentham seems to say, in any situation, that which maximizes happiness in that situation? Or should we do that? Should we follow that rule, which tends, in the long run, let's say, to maximize happiness, as Mill would say? It's an interesting, uh, it's an interesting problem within utilitarianism. And Judith Jarvis Thompson, who we'll read later, has a very interesting um, thought experiment here. The idea of patients who need new organs and problem for act utilitarianism and something that might set up a more palatable rule utilitarianism. So again, it's very well set out. This section on utilitarianism goes into some contemporary ones like Peter Singer, who we will read later, and people like that.